Okay, so a few will join us as we get started, but in the interest of time, we are going to start on this launch of the Global Methane Status Report. So, hello everyone, I am Sophie Bonnard. I work in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Secretariat as the Methane Flagship Coordinator, and I'm joined today by my colleague Jingyi He, with whom we coordinated this report, which is bringing us together today. So first and foremost, we would like to thank you very much for joining us for this online launch of the Global Methane Status Report. We are very happy to present you with this report, which is the result of several months of work from over 90 experts around the world. Together, they have worked to provide you with a clear picture of progress on methane abatement since the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, as well as an assessment of the remaining gap, and to showcase a range of solutions for increased and accelerated action on methane abatement. So the report was successfully launched last week on 17 November at COP30, where it supported the important momentum on methane that happened at COP. It's been captured by, it has captured global media and political attention, with headlines appearing in several important newspapers, and methane emerging as one of COP30's most reported topics. So it was important to us to organize these online launches to give you an opportunity to interact with the lead authors of the report. And a number of them are with us today, and will take you through the key findings and conclusions of the report. We only have 1 hour and a packed agenda, so we are going to get started now. And if you can move to the next slide, Jingyi, thank you very much. And so we'll start this launch with some key highlights of the report that will be presented to us by Drew Shindell from Duke University and chair of the CCAC Scientific Advisory Panel, who was also one of the steering committee members for the report and a lead author of Chapter 2. We will then turn to the key findings of our Chapter 2, so the 2025 Global Progress Analysis on Methane Emissions, which will be presented by Lina Oglund-Isaksson from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, lead author of the chapter. Then we'll turn to our chapter looking at the global outlook of methane policies and measures, and we'll go sector by sector. So we'll look at national planning with Chris Malley from SEI, at the energy sector with Jonathan Banks from the Clean Air Task Force, then at waste with Carlos Silva Filho, and then at agriculture with Crystal Crumpler from the FAO. Then we'll turn to our chapter on observed emissions and the role of empirical data. And the lead author, Stephen Hamburg from EDS, he will present us with the key findings. And finally, for the last chapter of the report on financing of methane abatement, we have with us Lauren Sidner from MIT, who's been the lead author of this chapter and will present us with the key findings. After this presentation, the idea is to have a short Q&A sessions, so your mics will be enabled for this part of the launch. But please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your question during the presentation as well. So with this, thank you very much once again for being with us. And I'm going to turn to Drew Shindell to tell us about the key highlights of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And thanks everybody for joining. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I wanted to go through some of the highlights of the report, as Sophie just said. But first I want to give a little bit of context here. I think we all know that we pretty much used up the entire carbon budget for 1.5, so we are facing overshoot of 1.5 degrees. We're not on track with our greenhouse gas emissions writ large, and methane is responsible for about 2/3 as much warming as CO2. So this is a really big part of the puzzle. It is one of the fastest, probably the fastest and most cost-effective way to slow climate change in the near term because of its short lifetime. And so every reduction we can make in methane, even if insufficient to put us on the now kind of in the rearview mirror 1.5-degree pathway, is still important, very important. And if this wasn't a good enough reason to act on methane from its climate point of view, we know that there are major air quality benefits, there are food security benefits, there are job opportunities, etc. So with that in mind, we wanted to really put together a status report, given the political urgency and the progress that we hope is being made under the Global Methane Pledge. And so some of the reports here, you can see a little bit of these on the left side, right? We have a potential to get 8% reduction in methane emissions by the target year of the Global Methane Pledge, 2030. We are not quite there yet, but this is the potential if countries follow and fully implement their NDCs and their methane plans, right? This would be, as it says there, the largest and most sustained projected decline in anthropogenic methane emissions in recorded history. We've had a couple little drops before for a year or two, but we've had nothing like this. We're unfortunately not quite on that path yet. This is where we'll get in a world where everything works out perfectly according to current plans. But at the present, emissions are still rising, and many of those plans have not really fully manifested yet. However, there is good news, and that the emissions are rising slower than we had projected just back in 2021 when we put together the global methane assessment. So much like the story of CO2, we're no longer on a track to 5 degrees or 6 degrees warming, something truly catastrophic, but we are still rising much more than we need. Methane is similar. We've made progress. We're no longer projected to keep going up as fast as we were before, but there is more to do, right? Political commitment has advanced greatly. And we have something like 159 countries signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. In addition to that, 2/3 of the parties to the Paris Agreement include methane now in their national plans. And that's a big jump compared to just 2020. So there has been this rise in ambition, rise in awareness, but we need to ramp up action to really meet the Global Methane Pledge target. If we do that, as we'll hear more from my colleagues in a moment, that's the middle part of that chart on the left there, right? We could actually achieve something like a 30% reduction in anthropogenic methane emissions with application of existing technology. That would meet the goals of the pledge, and that would provide all of these benefits, such as the 0.2 degrees of warming avoided, 180,000 premature deaths due to ozone, almost 20 million tons of avoided crop losses, and these would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars in economic benefits. These are for measures which often pay for themselves without even counting for those benefits, right? Once we count for those environmental benefits, you come out far ahead. And the report really identifies, as we'll hear from the sectors, where the biggest opportunities lie for the energy sector in particular, but also the waste and agricultural sectors. And we can see that over 80% of these reductions come at low annual cost, but that's not always enough, right? It's not necessarily purely a financial transaction that's being considered, and so the report highlights enabling conditions for success. So I would say overall, the Global Methane Status Report shows the world has momentum, especially political momentum and increased ambition. Cost-effective solutions exist today. Monitoring is helping us spot the key areas to most efficiently act, and the benefits of action would be enormous. Every ton of methane we avoid delivers cleaner air, stronger community, and a safer climate future. So with that, I'm going to turn back to the details from my colleagues on this report, and thank you again for joining us. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Drew. And I'm going to turn now to Lina Ogluni-Saxon from IASA to present us in more details with the key findings of the second chapter on the global progress analysis on methane emissions. Lina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie, and hello, everyone. So I'm Lena Höglund Isaksson from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I co-led Chapter 2 together with Drew Schindel, as well as contributions from many other colleagues, both here at IASA and many other institutions. So I think we can take the next slide, please. Thank you. So for Chapter 2, we used IASA's GAINS model framework for a quantitative analysis of the progress on mitigation of global methane emissions. We start from a baseline scenario that reflects the expected development in future emissions with no further uptake of legislation to control emissions than currently implemented. Since 2020, methane emissions from human activities have risen by a few percent. Agriculture accounts for about 42% of emissions, dominated by livestock, followed by rice cultivation. The energy sector accounts for 38%, in particular fugitive emissions during oil, gas, and coal extraction, and wastewater for 20%. The G20 plus group of countries, which here refers to the 19 largest economies, and in addition, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, Iceland, and the rest of the EU member states, account for in total 65% of global emissions. With current legislation, global emissions are expected to increase, to continue to increase, so by 5% between 2020 and 2030, and by 21% between 2020 and 2050. This is a somewhat slower growth than projected in the 2021 Global Methane Assessment at the time of the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, when a 9% increase in emissions was expected between 2020 and 2030. Important reasons for the slower growth are investments into improved waste management in the last 2 decades, having net negative effects on current waste emissions, in particular in high-income regions like Europe and North America, as well as an assumption that production of unconventional gas would peak in 2025 instead of steadily increasing. The latter is an assumption that is currently challenged by the most recent developments in global energy markets. Next slide, please. Thank you. But a 5% increase between 2020 and 2030 is still far from the pledge target of a 30% reduction. What about countries' current plans for methane reductions? So we scanned through the national determined contributions and methane mitigation roadmaps and action plans as submitted by countries by June this year for measures explicitly or implicitly targeting methane emissions. So if all the mentioned measures are fully implemented, the current rise in emissions could be reversed and translate to an 8% reduction between 2020 and 2030. Even if it is not enough to meet the pledge target, such a reduction would still be the largest drop in methane emissions in recorded history, as we also heard from Drew earlier. And it would correspond to 0.06 degrees avoided warming by 2050. Because methane also acts as a precursor for the formation of ground level ozone, a pollutant that damages human health and crop yields. The foreseen methane emission reduction would also prevent 60,000 premature deaths and over 6 million tons of crop losses per year to a value of over $100 billion. Next, please. So meeting the pledge target requires further raising ambition. With maximum implementation of existing technology to control methane, emissions could be reduced by 32% between 2020 and 2030, thereby avoiding a 0.2 degrees warming by 2050, with the benefits of avoided effects of ozone formation valued at over $300 billion per year. 72% of the maximum technically feasible reduction potential is found in the G20 plus group of countries mentioned before. Next, please. So the ambition level needs to ramp up, but the good news is that many measures are cost effective, and over 80% of the technical mitigation potential in 2030 is available at a low cost of less than $1,000 per ton methane or $36 per ton CO2 equivalent. The cost of a full implementation of all existing technical measures by 2030 is estimated at $127 billion annually. The energy sector holds the largest technical mitigation potential and could reduce so the energy sector holds 72% of the total global technical mitigation potential in 2030, and agriculture 18%, and wastewater 10%. So the energy sector is really the sector that could do the most by 2030. The waste sector holds significant mitigation potential, but with effects on emissions primarily expected post 2030, because there are large amounts of organic waste already deposited in landfills that will continue to decay and release methane in the coming years. But it underlines the importance of investing early into improved waste management. Next, please. So the report lists more than 40 proven technical measures that we have identified for the report, and also shows here a table with mitigation potential and costs in the different scenarios and sectors. And so I would encourage you to look more closely in detail into this table. Next, please. Thank you. In the longer time frame beyond 2030, so going on 2050, methane mitigation action and ambition must continue and be strengthened. If full implementation of the existing technical mitigation potential is combined with parallel efforts to both decarbonize the global energy systems, as well as transition to healthier, more plant-based human diets and reduce generation of food waste, global methane emissions from human activities could be more than halved by 2050, which compared to 2020. And this would actually be consistent with pathways that keeping within 1.5 degrees of global warming. Thank you very much. And I hand over to Sophie.
Thank you so much, Lina. And so now turning to the global outlook of methane policies and measures, to put those numbers presented by Lina into perspective. The report has been looking into the three main emitting sectors, as well as national planning for methane mitigation. And so starting with national planning, we are going to hear the key highlights of the section from Chris Mallet from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And he apologized for not being able to be with us today, but he sent a video to speak to the key findings of this section.
Hi, thank you very much for letting me be part of the launch of the Global Methane Status Report online. It's nice to be here. I was an author on the national planning part of the report, and in contrast to many other sections of the report, which provide sobering reading in terms of how close we are to achieving the global methane pledge 5 years on from its establishment, Within this section of the report, we do see some very positive trends on parts of the global methane pledge below the overall target of reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030. We used as an analytical framework in this section of the report both what the pledge says that countries commit to by participating in the pledge, which is to work together to achieve a 30% reduction in global methane emissions, yes, but also to move to the more advanced methodologies for monitoring methane emissions within their domestic borders and working on domestic actions to reduce methane emissions. So we took that as our starting point as to what we wanted to assess and evaluate within this section. And then we used the framework developed as part of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's Methane Roadmap Action Programme initiative, which aimed to support countries to take that global pledge and downscale it to identify what contribution an individual country can make. The Methane Roadmap Action Programme has 5 building blocks that constitute a methane roadmap: the ability to assess one's emissions, to have the analytical capability to evaluate policies and measures, to be able to set targets on methane, to understand implementation pathways, and then to be able to look at monitoring. We see positive trends across each of these different building blocks. On the emissions and monitoring part, there has been a huge step change, particularly among developing countries, in the number of countries that are using tier 2 and above IPCC methodologies to quantify methane emissions. For example, in developing countries, in non-Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC, there's been a 69% increase in the number of countries using tier 2 plus methods to quantify emissions from livestock, and a 50% increase to quantify emissions, methane emissions from waste. When we look at targets, the floor for methane targets that we look at when we look at NDCs is whether a country includes methane within the scope of its overall greenhouse gas reduction target. And on a country by country level, we see that most countries do that, but there has been very significant progress on that in recently, with China now moving to set its NDC targets covering all greenhouse gases, including methane. Methane was not included previously. So this is sort of the minimum that we can say that a country has a target to reduce methane, when reducing methane will contribute to achieving your overall NDC target, providing a motivation to take action on methane. There's far fewer countries that take the extra step of establishing what the methane component of that overall target is. We do see some leaders there with 31 countries establishing some sort of methane specific target within their NDCs, whether an overall methane target or a percentage reduction in a particular sector, for example. When we then look at the building block on pathways, if we analyze the NDCs, there's been a huge increase in the number of countries identifying actions to reduce methane in agriculture, in waste, and in fossil fuel production since the Global Methane Pledge was established. About 65% of countries, and this number is already out of date, it's higher than that as new NDCs have come out during COP30, include methane-specific actions within their NDCs, which is more than a 50% increase compared to before the Global Methane Pledge was established. So we see a lot of positive trajectories when we dig below the uncomfortable truth that methane emissions are still increasing. We know that people are monitoring methane more accurately and precisely using more detailed and appropriate methodologies. We see that people are committing to more actions, setting methane targets. What we need now is for that to translate into implementation on the ground. One thing we've seen in the progress that we track in the national planning activities is that much of this has been led through actions in developing countries. We need all countries now to begin to work together to ensure the finance is there, to ensure that national planning, national commitments on methane are translated into specific projects, into specific projects that can actually reduce methane emissions. So that's the type of thing that we'll be looking out for as the Global Methane Status Report gets updated over the next few years. Thank you very much.
All right, so following national planning, let's now go through the three main emitting sectors and look a little bit, the other sections looked at how those national commitments translated on the ground in sectoral policies targeting methane abatement. And so starting with the sector that bears the most opportunities for rapid and significant mitigations, the energy sector. I'm turning to you, Jonathan Banks from CATF, to introduce to us the key findings of this section.
Thanks, Sophie. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I think just quickly pulling off of some points there that Chris was making in his intervention. One of the things I mentioned last week at COP when we were releasing the Global Methane Status Report, and then when we had the Global Methane Pledge Ministerial, when you look at the numbers here, I think some people look at it in two different ways. It's like glass half full, glass half empty. There is some progress and there's not enough progress. I think one of the things that Commissioner Jorgensen said from the European Commission, when we launched the report, he mentioned that he wants everybody to have a little patience, and people were asking, what does he mean by that? And I think what he meant was we need to have a little bit of patience for these policies, like Chris was talking about, for those things to mature, to actually get regulation, for the regulations to start getting reductions. But at the same time, we also need to be exceedingly impatient because there's so much more that has to be done. I think when you start to look at the fossil fuels sector, that's where we have to be the most impatient. We have to start to see more policies being put in place that can drive the kinds of reductions that are so critically needed. The fossil fuel sector, by far and away, has the most reductions that can be done in the near term. These are things that are often described as the low-hanging fruit. Many of them are the low-hanging fruit that falls off the tree and lands on your table. These are things that we can do, and we can do immediately. I think the other important piece that the study shows is that decarbonization will not lead to the methane reductions that we need. It will help a little bit, but in order to get the methane reductions we need in the time that we need them, we have to actually target methane emissions from the fossil fuel sector. So the combined efforts of decarbonization and targeting methane from the oil and gas sector and the coal sector, that's the only thing that's going to allow us to start to bend the curve on climate and help us to meet our climate objectives. Next slide, please. Since the launch of the pledge, we have seen a great improvement in the number, as well as the innovation around policies to address oil and gas. We've seen many countries come forward with new policies, many of which are being implemented right now. We've got a whole bunch of additional countries that are in the midst of putting together policies to address oil and gas. And we're seeing innovative pieces like the EU import standard, which is in its first phase of implementation right now, but by 2030 will require a performance standard for the oil and gas that is imported into the EU. Currently, there's about 20 major importers into the EU, so the potential of this one policy to really dramatically shift emissions is quite profound. And we're also seeing other initiatives like the Clean Initiative in Asia that seeks to start to build towards something akin to the EU import standard. Right now, it's only focused on improving data quality, but we're seeing other initiatives start to emerge that could dramatically start to impact the global trade of oil and gas and drive down emissions. In addition, the voluntary industry initiatives have grown dramatically. Programs like OGMP and OGDC cover about 40 to 45% of global oil and gas output. And that's a strong improvement. And the process that the companies are going through to try to improve their data quality under OGMP is really helping companies understand better where their emissions are coming from and where the opportunities are. In the coal sector, that's definitely a contrasting element. We're not seeing the same kinds of policy growth in the coal sector. There are technologies and solutions available in the coal sector, but policy development in the area is lagging far behind, and we greatly need to see that start to move forward. There is new policy in the EU that could start to open some doors for learning opportunities there, but there's definitely a need for more there. Next slide, please. The big piece that we still see is really needing is around making sure that we're breaking down the barriers to implementation. We're seeing fragmented regulation, sometimes either weak enforcement or a lack of capacity for enforcement. Lack of emissions monitoring capacity exists in some places, and for some of the national oil companies, limited access to finance is hindering their ability to tackle methane emissions. To really see the full methane mitigation potential in this sector, we really need to see urgent and coordinated action to scale up the solutions that are, very evident and very proven. Otherwise, we'll never be able to fully harness the potential here, particularly in the oil and gas sector. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, we really need to see countries stepping forward to take the first actions to really be innovative in how to tackle the coal sector. That's a critical space that we need to explore. And I think I'm done. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we are now going to turn to the waste sector. And Carlos, the floor is yours. I've seen that Aditi Ramola, the other lead author, was also connected. So I don't know how you want to take this. And just to ask you kindly if you can try to really stick to 4 minutes so we make sure we have at least a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Thank you very much. And Carlos and Aditi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and join you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And for us who've been able to join this development of this report is an immense pleasure to really share these key messages and outcomes. I had the honor to have Aditi Ramola as the co-author of the Waste and Wastewater chapter, together with several other friends and experts. And the message is clear. If we continue business as usual, methane emissions from the waste and wastewater sector are projected to increase around 13% by 2030 and by 56% by 2050 compared to 2020 levels. This is what we've been discussing at COP30 this year in Belém, and like how to really tackle these increased potential, increased emissions, methane emissions from the several sectors we just heard from the energy sector now by Jonathan. So but the modeling shows that the full deployment of technical measures in the waste sector could reduce annual emissions by 13 million tons of methane per year by 2030. And the benefits that we make before that, or like ahead of 2030, the window is narrowing, will really be crucial for us to achieve those reduced emissions, because we can really act now to prevent further emissions in the future. The benefits of the investments we make before 2030 in better landfill design, gas capture, and diversion of organics will grow over time and are projected to deliver around 21 million tons of methane reduction per year by 2040, as emissions from legacy waste start to fall. We also need to highlight that the mitigation opportunities in the waste sector and the wastewater sector are highly cost effective. So those measures could deliver net cost savings of around $9 billion per year by 2030. And important to highlight that almost 90% of the technical mitigation potential in the waste and wastewater sector are low cost. So we need to really to consider this as the low-hanging fruit. Next slide, please. The report highlights that many countries and municipalities have already shown that the significant methane mitigation is achievable for the waste and the wastewater sector, and the measures are cost effective, as we've seen, and often comes at net savings. Some main barriers remain. We identified weak regulatory framework and its enforcement, insufficient infrastructure and technical capacity, fragile financial systems with low fee collection, and underdeveloped markets with limited demand for valorized outputs. The fragmented governance and low public awareness collectively constrain integrated waste management. So finally, what can we do now? We would say that really effective mitigation of methane emissions from waste and wastewater sectors demands systemic change, supported by a comprehensive policy framework. What do I mean with that? That we need to combine regulatory measures and improved operations and infrastructures being deployed. We need to bring additional economic instruments that make low emissions options the rational choice. We cannot compare inadequate practices with better practice. We really need to enforce this as a rational choice. Sustained investment in infrastructure and capacity building are key. And I would say, on top of that, we need to recognize that there is a relevant link between better waste management and wastewater treatment and climate mitigation. Therefore, I believe the 3D future that we are pledging, in which we decouple economic growth from waste generation, decontaminate products and the environment, and decarbonize the economies, mostly from superpollutants, are the way forward. So we need to consider the waste sector, including wastewater, as a strategic climate and development priority. Those are the key messages the report shows and the way forward for us to really act when we still have time. Thank you very much for the attention, and I hand back to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you very much as well to Aditi, who co-led this section with you. I would like now to turn to the third main emitting sector for methane, which is in fact the sector that's the first most important emitting sector, which is the agricultural one. The section of the report on this sector has been led by the FAO, and so I would like to turn to you, Crystal Crumpler, to take us through the findings of this section. And if I can ask you to please as well really keep to 4 minutes so we have time to go through our agenda today. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Sophie. And I'm presenting, unfortunately, Martial Bernoux is not with us today, but he's the other co-author. So agriculture is the largest source of global anthropogenic methane emissions, accounting for 42% of total emissions, mainly from livestock and rice cultivation as the primary drivers, and agricultural waste burning represent quite a smaller share overall. Without additional mitigation, we see that emissions are expected to rise by 8% by 2030 and 17% by 2050. Mainly due to increases in livestock populations in Africa and Latin America. Attention to what we are seeing is that attention to agricultural methane and national policies has nearly doubled in the NDCs, yet these are still falling short of their potential. So as we saw around, there were 45 countries mentioning or including agricultural methane mitigation measures in their NDCs before 2020, and now we see 85 countries. That's nearly double. And these commitments are translating mainly into a stabilization of agricultural methane emissions in 2030, not necessarily a reduction. And while commitments have increased, we do see that the specificity of the target could be strengthened. So only 4% of NDCs are actually including those quantified time-bound agricultural methane reduction targets that you would need to really track and implement concrete pathways to get there, right? Collectively, current plans in the NDCs are tapping into just half of the sector's full cost-effective mitigation potential, meaning that there's scope for substantial improvements going forward. However, there is a generally positive trend when we look at the integration of agricultural methane reduction into national policies, which is what's needed to implement what are in the climate NDCs and climate commitments. The majority of policies, however, are focusing mainly on emissions from animal waste, things like turning manure into a resource, as opposed to enteric fermentation, which is actually a greater source. So overall, around 2% of GMP participating countries have policies in force that are addressing some of the key agricultural sources. Another key message is that the ag sector has the technical potential to reduce emissions 8% below of 2020 level in this decade, meaning that the ag sector has the second largest sectoral contribution to achieving the maximum technically feasible reduction scenario. On average, we see that mitigation is slightly more costly in the ag sector than it is in the sector of energy. This is mainly due to increases in demand for food and technical limitations around certain mitigation options, but low-cost mitigation options do exist. And these include mainly water savings through improved rice cultivation, bans on agricultural waste burning, and improved livestock management with significant potential in the Americas and Western Europe. Another thing to mention is that building climate resilient livestock systems can deliver multiple benefits. So these are things like pairing animal welfare improvements with gender equality and social inclusion-based approaches, which in both simultaneously improve productivity and reduce emissions. Another key finding from the report is that, while financial and institutional and technical barriers do persist, there's an opportunity to redirect just a small share of harmful agricultural subsidies to close the finance gap and unlock greater methane mitigation potential. We see a finance gap, particularly for agricultural methane, in the realm of 9 billion per year. And this, while large amounts is very pale in comparison to the 1 trillion being directed to the sector each year in the form of inefficient and harmful subsidies. Repurposing just 3% of that could help to close the gap for the sector. As we heard from other colleagues, continued improvements in transitioning to Tier 2 greenhouse gas inventories and enhancing MRV systems can also help to enhance transparency and policy accountability going forward. And I think I'll end with saying, kind of speaking to the uniqueness of the agricultural sector, we see that tackling the barriers to agricultural methane mitigation requires leveraging those co-benefits for sustainable development as drivers of change, right? So the uptake of agricultural methane reduction policies is strongest. The evidence shows when mitigation objectives are linked to other policy objectives, which we've seen valued in the report. Things like enhanced productivity, reduced food insecurity, reduce water pollution, and turning agricultural waste into a resource for rural households. At the same time, holistic and equity-based policies are therefore needed to avoid unintended consequences. So these are things like shifting of emissions to unregulated sources, or avoiding trade-offs of, say, increasing food prices falling disproportionately on vulnerable populations. So research is needed to better understand the effectiveness of different mitigation measures in different contexts, and the role of demand-side strategies such as dietary shifts and food waste as well. Back over to you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And so, as we've heard, the role of empirical data has been underlined as an important barrier, and at the same time as a key area for rapid progress in each of the 3 main emitting sectors. And so I'm going to turn now to Stephen Hamburg to tell us about the key findings of our chapter on observed emissions and the role of empirical data. Stephen, the floor is yours. And as for others, just keeping time in mind, if you could stick to 4 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks, everyone. I will be brief. The bottom line is that we are undergoing a data revolution, and that's a really good thing for the challenges that we've heard in reducing methane emissions. That data revolution really makes a difference. We've heard about the mitigation options that are currently available, and the key to realizing those mitigations is that we need measurement-based data. It becomes essential because high-quality data is really key to accelerating mitigation and assessing those reductions. These data provide us a much clearer understanding of where the emissions are occurring and how they change and in time and space. With that kind of data, we can drive much more rapid change than if we don't have it and we use generalities. And also critically important to realizing this potential is the fact that we have the International Methane Emissions Observatory established by governments around the world, where we have uniquely a single repository, a single place where all these methane data are brought together and integrated to create usable data products. This provides a clear understanding for both the technical teams that are working on this as well as governments to really understand what we're seeing with respect to methane emissions. The methods to do this, the technology and the approaches to need this are available across the sectors we've heard about, and they do work. Some are more further ahead than in other cases, but we can implement reductions by looking through using these methods to help us understand the challenge before us. And one of the things that's really important to note is in the studies that we've done on fossil fuels, which we heard about earlier, or we know probably the most detailed information of any of the sectors, is we see consistently that emissions are underreported. And as I said before, understanding the details is absolutely key to meeting the challenge before us. And we've seen in the fossil fuel industry that with the kind of data that we can collect, high quality, transparent data, reliable data, we understand the problem far better and we are more effective. So we feel confident that if we bring these tools and methodologies deploy them more widely across the multiple sectors we've heard about, we really can see the mitigation that we need and get the results that we want and the globe demands. There are diverse tools available, and as I mentioned, they are applicable across sectors. So in summary, I just want to reiterate that we are seeing a dramatic change in the ability to use empirical data to drive mitigation, to do it more effectively, and to bring that data collectively together through international agency, in the case of International Methane Emissions Observatory, which is a unit of UNEP. And together, that change in the landscape represents an enormously positive development over the past 5 years to allow us to radically change emissions patterns. With that, I'm cautiously optimistic we can meet the challenge before us. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think the message was loud and clear. And I'm turning now to Lauren Sidner from MIT to speak to us about the key findings of the chapter on financing methane abatement. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and I'll be quick since I know we're running out of time here. So I think we're all pretty familiar with, different analysis showing that climate finance in one area or another is kind of falling short of what's needed. And it's true that while tracked methane finance has trended up in recent years, it does still fall short of estimated 2030 investment needs. And the chapter shows that. But critically, the chapter also shows that the scale of resources that are needed to achieve reductions in line with the global methane pledges is in no way out of reach. So the chapter primarily relies on like the rest of the report, Gaines model unit abatement cost data to estimate those needs, and it uses CPI analysis of tracked methane finance to contextualize those estimates. And as mentioned, tracked methane finance has trended up since the global methane pledge adoption and in the years since, and the sources of finance are becoming more varied over time, so that's positive. But to achieve the level of action needed, that finance needs to increase by roughly 9-fold by 2030 compared to 2022 levels. Specifically, according to Gaines, the costs in 2030 to implement the maximum technically feasible reduction scenario that Lena talked about earlier is roughly 127 billion per year. The energy sector, of course, contributes the majority of those costs at nearly 98 billion in costs in 2030. An annualized cost. And while that number is significant, the primary responsibility for investing in methane mitigation lies with the fossil fuel companies, and the estimated costs represent just a very small fraction of the sector's annual net income in recent years. Importantly, and I'll skip ahead a little, reaching the level of investment needed, and we speak to this in the chapter with some of the case studies we go through, it requires a kind of clear-eyed recognition of the fact that the resource needs are varied, ranging from support for technical assistance, capacity building, and R&D, to project preparation, to concessional finance, to commercial capital. And access to capital isn't always the only or even the primary barrier to greater action on methane. Sometimes things like inadequate policy incentives or data gaps or institutional capacity, a lack of bankable projects. Sometimes these things need to be addressed in parallel to the finance question. So that means that a wide variety of actors need to step up in order to fill this investment gap, from governments and philanthropy to the various development finance institutions to corporations, financial institutions, and investors, kind of all of the above. And the chapter walks through kind of real world examples of progress and positive steps by these types of actors, showing what progress can look like and what it looks like for those actors to step up and coordinate their efforts and catalyze real investment on the ground. I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And we are arriving at our time. So just to say that, yes, in essence, we can see that what this report is telling us is that we have built a strong foundation since the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, but we must now really accelerate and scale up, strengthen policies, enhance measurement and reporting, and significantly increase financing for implementation. So we have 1 minute left, yet I would like to allow for 1 or 2 questions if there are some from the room. In case time is too short or you cannot stay on, we are of course available to take your question after this online launch as well. The recording of the launch will be posted on our website. But yes, feel free to ask any question you may have right now in the Q&A, or raise your hand so we can give you the floor.
Sophie,
Yes.
there was a question at least before in the Q&A.
Yes, I
don't see it anymore, but maybe I can quickly address it if there's no other. So there was a question about whether we had considered more than food waste. Yes, we consider not only food waste, but also methane emissions from other organic waste like paper, wood. Yeah, that would be the more important ones. And also the 8% reduction that we see if full implementation of the NDCs refers to all sectors, not only waste, but across all the sectors.
Thank you so much, Lina. As said, we are here to take any other question after this launch as well. And with this, I would like to thank you all very much for taking part to this launch. And as you've heard today, it's not time to rest yet, but we have a huge opportunity ahead of us that we really need to seize and that can deliver critical benefits in the next 5 years for climate and clean air. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to continuing the work with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great week.